Hello, and welcome to today's Inquirer Live conversation on Chapter 1 of A More Perfect Union. I'm Errin Haines, contributing editor for the project, and I edited this story by journalist Wesley Lowery. So A More Perfect Union examines the roots of systemic racism in America through institutions founded in Philadelphia. For the next year, the Inquirer will explore some of the institutions that form the cornerstones of our democracy and society, linking them directly to ongoing harm against Philadelphians living today. Joining me in this ambitious work will be journalists from inside and outside of the Inquirer newsroom, and others committed to a clear-eyed look at these institutions and their impact. I want to just, before we get started, encourage all of you to submit comments and questions throughout this discussion. I know we've had a few days to kind of unpack the story, and people have already come to me with so many responses and reactions, and we want to get to as many of those as we can today. So you can do this by using the comment section that's at the bottom of this page. And if you're watching us on social media, just head over to inquirer.com/live to submit your questions. Okay, and so with that, I would love to get started. We are going to kick this conversation off with me talking to Wesley Lowery, who is the writer of Chapter 1. Wesley is a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, author, and one of the country's foremost journalists on issues of race, law enforcement, and social justice. Wesley's worked at the Washington Post, he's worked at the Boston Globe, and most recently, he was a correspondent for 60 Minutes Plus. Wesley's also a frequent critic of the American media, and he brought that lens to Black City White Paper, the exhaustive look at the 193-year history of the Philadelphia Inquirer, its legacy of systemic racism, and its current impact on the newsroom. Welcome, Wesley.
Lovely to be here with you, Errin.
Thank you so much. I mean, look, thank you for being here. Thank you for your work on this piece, which is more than 6,400 words and could have been longer. I guess I'll start with just saying, we are not part of the Inquirer newsroom. Neither one of us are natives of Philadelphia. I mean, I've lived here since 2015, but am not from here. But together we executed this story to really kind of set the stage for a more perfect union. So let me start by asking you to talk about what drew you to this project and why you wanted to tell this story.
Sure. Well, first of all, when Errin Haines calls me, I answer the phone. And so,
aside from that.
So that was step one. But look, I think that we've now have entered the second year or almost the third year of so-called reckonings across American institutions. And I think it's important, and I think journalism has an important role to play in this conversation about what our role has been historically, whether we've been forces for good, for bad, and for the indifferent, to uphold the status quo. And there's something extremely intriguing about an institution like the Philadelphia Inquirer, one of the most storied, legendary newspapers and news organizations in our country, being willing to turn the lens back at itself, right? I think that, and so when you called, when you told me a bit about this project, it seemed very interesting to me, and it also seemed like a fascinating opportunity to really speak with Black journalists currently at the paper as well as formerly at the paper about what their experiences are and what their experiences were. I think that was extremely important. When you look at an institution like the Inquirer, there's a million things, a million different ways a piece like this could go.
Yeah.
And I think that the piece itself tries to do a lot of different things. And we could have gone 6,000 words on any one of them individually, telling the paper's history, looking at what's happening contemporarily in terms of its anti-racist efforts, litigating its coverage and its relationship with the community, hearing from current and former staff members. All of those things themselves could merit thousands and thousands of words. We try to kind of do it all together, but also to have a kind of an unsparing look backwards. What we know is that most American newspapers that have survived were not intended to be for or by the Black citizenry. And that's not to say that in recent decades there have not been real good faith efforts to remedy that and to address that. There have been, but we know that those efforts have not worked. They failed, they've fallen short. And so I think one of our questions was how do we look back and try to answer the why of that?
Yeah, and especially and to do that work so that we can figure out how we do things differently going forward, so that we can get to a different outcome, right?
Mm-hmm.
For our industry and for our society. So, I mean, what would you say for you was really the main or biggest takeaway for you, just in terms of the Inquirer specifically and journalism more broadly as a result of reporting this piece?
Sure. I think that the story of the Inquirer is the story of the American newspaper. That when you look at its history, and you look at its efforts at integration, which was really the era that we focused on, starting in 1954 when Bob Thomas becomes the first Black reporter full-time at the Inquirer, and how we get to 2020 when George Floyd is killed and there's one Black male on the city desk, right? In looking at that 70-year period where the Inquirer was explicitly seeking to be an integrated newsroom, and to serve all of Philadelphia, both in the city and more broadly in the region, and trying to look at and trying to gauge the extent to which that was done well. And to what extent in which that was done at all. I think that we know in terms of the diversity within the room and diversity of leadership, we know that there have been struggles and difficulties. I think that when we talk about and when we look at the coverage itself, editors and writers themselves acknowledge that while the paper often was good on issues of civil rights, it was not very good always on actually covering Black Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk to Black community leaders, we quoted Mark Tyler, but there were others as well. Time and time again, what they would talk about, what they would insist is that that day to day, functionally, the Inquirer has not been the paper for Black Philadelphia. And so if in this moment, the goal of the Inquirer is to be that paper, I think there were big questions about what that requires and if those relationships can be repaired.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to remind folks, if you have questions for Wesley, please do submit them at the bottom of your screen or go to Inquirer Live, inquirer.com/live to submit those questions. So, I mean, yeah, what am I trying to ask you? What conclusions, if any, did you reach after reporting this piece about the Inquirer or about American journalism and this reckoning around our beloved institution?
Well, look, I think it's clear the Inquirer is working and working hard. Is it doing the right work, and how is that work turning out? Those are different questions, right? And I think that there's a reasonable debate about the answers to those questions, whether or not this is the right way to engage in that work, whether or not it's going to make a big enough difference, and whether or not it's too little, too late, which might also be true. You never know. But I do think that one thing the Inquirer has gotten right internally is really trying to go down to the root in terms of thinking about what are its processes, how does it do coverage, what are the things that kind of are automated in terms of how it uses mugshots or how it writes up crime briefs, right? Having conversations and difficult conversations with editors and with others about framing and how how we or how the paper launches out on a given story, if not. The one thing I do think is true, as I did this reporting, as I talked to other people as well, I do think that there is a need and an ongoing need for the Inquirer to be in conversation with its community about these conversations, right? That I think sometimes it's easy for us, those of us in the industry and the newspaper, to have this conversation amongst ourselves, right? And it's obviously true that Black Philadelphians may want things that are different than even what their Black journalists want or what Black Inquirer journalists want, right? And so I do think that being in conversation with Black Philadelphians is the chief and most important way to be held accountable by Black Philadelphians, and also to provide them with the services and the product that they want. And I think that, like I said, I think step one, I think the paper had to grapple even with being honest and hearing directly from its own former Black staff first, much less even from the broader Black community.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, obviously one of the most important relationships that any newspaper can have is being in a relationship with community, with its various communities, right? So that it can be more reflective and representative of the community that they claim they want to cover, right? And cover more holistically. So that's how, that is how they begin to get on the journey of being an Inquirer for all, right? As the motto suggests. So we've got a couple of questions here coming in. I'm going to ask, one, Wesley, what specific process do you think could increase connection with the Black community?
Well, I don't necessarily know that it's my job to prescribe what the
Sure.
Inquirer should do or not. I know that some folks specifically have asked or have talked about a community advisory board that would be weighing in on these types of decisions or be participating in projects like this. I think that if that's a suggestion that comes from the community, I think that's one the paper should take very seriously. I think that, but I think about this, Erin and I were actually on a different panel not too long ago. I think about this about who are we accountable to? Who is a paper, who is a reporter accountable to? And I think that the I think the Inquirer, in order to be held accountable, you have to be in conversation. You have to be there, and so I think that whether that be via community town halls, or whether it be showing up in the places where Black Philadelphians are, whether the in part it's why you need to have Black staffers, because Black staffers are going to happen to be running into Black Philadelphians and are going to hear about how they think of the coverage, what they don't. And so I think all of that, I think all of that is important.
Yeah. I mean, so that A More Perfect Union, chapter 1 is only the beginning of this project. We are going to be looking at other institutions that were born in Philadelphia. But I wonder if you have thoughts on, I mean, I obviously do as contributing editor, but thoughts on why it was important to start with journalism, the institution of journalism, and the Inquirer in particular as, the vehicle for having this conversation and for publishing this project. Why it was important to start with the Inquirer.
Sure. I think that it's very hard to hold other people accountable if you as an institution have not been held accountable yourself on those same issues. And I also think that the institution of the media and the press is one of the most vital. That if we look around our country and we examine the status quo, the press has some culpability in what the current status quo is. We either prop things up or we tear them down. And so when we look around our nation, our city, our region, if there are things that we dislike or things that do not work, things that are inequitable, those of us in the press, we have some responsibility for that. And so I think it's important. I think it's very important for us to have those conversations internally, and for the Inquirer to show people that it's willing to look at itself. Now, I think that one of the critiques that is fair is that actions speak louder than words, and right. And so I think that the Inquirer interrogating itself is a welcome first step. I think an important first step. Although again, how important or how welcome that is up to the people of Philadelphia, not of me. But I think it's also a point well made that the most urgent thing that the Inquirer can do to rebuild these relationships is to do the work of rebuilding these relationships.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you and I have talked about this. I mean, the entire project is meant to be a mirror for all of these institutions, journalism, certainly being first among them with chapter 1. So, doing the work from here is now on that institution, right? And who they decide that they're going to do that work with. So just one more before we've got to let you go. So of course you mentioned that this could have been a longer article. It absolutely could have. I can speak as your editor that it certainly was a longer article. Were there any interesting discoveries that you left out that you would be willing to share with us now?
I don't know about particular discoveries, although I will say, Bob Thomas, the first Black staff member, there was a little rabbit hole about him. He'd gone on an NBC television show and had gotten hired on at the Inquirer in part because he had helped them track down these members of a Black gang and give an as told to first person piece for the Inquirer. And so it was interesting. The first Black reporter was hired to cover Black crime, essentially, and then ends up going on this TV show, which was just fascinating little rabbit hole we went down for a bit in terms of the reporting. Look, the piece could have been much longer. I think that to properly tell the history of a place like the Inquirer, you probably need 600,000 words, not 6,000 words. But I think things that we were able to get at, but that we didn't develop out as fully. I think that it would have been great to lean even further into the way that the economic ups and downs of the paper has over the years undercut diversity and inclusion efforts. If one of the key questions is figuring out how to prevent that undercutting from happening again now, I think that diving in more into the relationship between the Daily News and the Inquirer, the now defunct sister paper that did cover the city, I think is interesting. But I also think, and one thing we talked a lot about was to what extent should we be looking at the coverage that the paper itself provided? Ultimately, that's not really what we did in this piece. We were looking much more at the experience of Black staff members. But there is an interesting question to be asked about, even among some of the crusading, hard-charging coverage provided by the Inquirer, if it did not inadvertently have collateral consequences that estranged it from the Black community. And I definitely think there are some marquee projects historically that have done that came up in our reporting. And so don't want to go too deep into it because obviously we didn't include it and didn't report it all the way out. But I certainly do think that there's a whole other piece to be written looking at the coverage by the Inquirer itself, and where that has fallen on the scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And the impact to Black Philadelphians looking outward from the paper instead of the inward look that you did such a good job of doing. Well, listen, we could keep going, but I know we've got to let you go because we've got to get on with this conversation. But listen, thank you again for your work on this. And, this is the beginning of this conversation. And I'm so glad that you were here to help us kick this off.
Of course. Thanks, Errin.
Take care. So now we're going to shift to a conversation with the leadership of the Inquirer, none of whom, by the way, were involved in the editorial process for this story, although they did participate in interviews with Wesley. So in fact, they did not read a single word of Black City White paper until it was published on February 15th. So with that, I want to introduce the Inquirer leadership team. We have first Gabriel Escobar, who is editor and senior vice president of the Inquirer. Welcome, Gabe.
Hi, Errin.
Next, we have Lisa Hughes, who is CEO and the publisher of the Philadelphia Inquirer. Welcome,
Hi,
Lisa.
Errin.
And last but certainly not least, we have Jameel Rush, who is Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Jameel.
Hey, Errin, how are you doing?
Great. Thank you all so much for joining and for being a part of this conversation. Look, I want to start by just asking each of you about your initial reaction to the piece. Like I said, you didn't see it before it was published. Did anything surprise you when you read it? What struck you? Gabe, I'll start with you.
So yes, you're right. I had no idea what it would be. In fact, I thought about how hard the journalistic mission was when you consider the long history of the Inquirer. So I was surprised, frankly, that it was a modern look and an internal look at the Inquirer. It was very thorough, and for those of us who have been familiar with the newspaper for years. There was information in it that I did not know. So it was a narrow frame, considering the 193 years, but very thoroughly done and illuminating.
Well, thank you for that. Jameel, what about you? Your thoughts?
Yeah, especially being someone who's newer to the organization. So I joined in January of 2021. I butt up against some of the things that came up in that paper without always understanding the history there. And what was really compelling to me, it's that the people that were mentioned, it feels like history, but many of the people who were mentioned in those stories, who had those experiences, ASO, they're friends of individuals who currently work here, mentors of people who currently work here. So this is not like we're talking about generations and generations ago. We're talking about a leadership, people who set the tone for current individuals inside of our newsroom and beyond. So just the recency of it all, and how fresh it can feel for many of our journalists and staff members, knowing that this is part of their career journey, not just part of the history of the Inquirer itself.
Yeah, absolutely. The idea that it's not even just recent past, but it is present. It is with us even as we speak. Lisa, what would you add to that?
I want to start with again what Gabe said, which is the organizing principle. How do you tackle a almost 200-year-old institution? And that must have been a lot of interesting conversations between you and Wes about like literally how would you go in? And I thought it was very smart to do a modern look because that's what we are working in now. So I'm really focused on okay, where are we at in our journey? And what do we still need to be really focused on and doing? I was encouraged by what I thought was, the acknowledgement that this is really, really hard work, but we are making some progress, and I think it really came through how hard this work is. As Wes said, there's a lot of false starts. Why? How do we get this one right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I feel like, for us laying out, the 190 years that comes before the work that you all are only really at the beginning of in this latest iteration of trying to make things different. It was very important to recognize just how much of the past you all are up against in trying to turn this ship around. And so, yeah, definitely, it was very daunting, but we tried to wrangle as best we could that perspective about the institution into chapter 1. So it's been now, I guess, about 10 days since the story has been out. So giving all of us a little bit of time to process it and the reaction to it. I'm wondering if anything has changed for any of you in terms of how you thought about the story since it first came out versus now. Or has anything changed in terms of how you think about where the Inquirer goes from here? Jameel, let's start with you this time.
Yeah, and I think our path forward still remains the same. Last year was spent, at least the last year that I was here, was spent on a lot of internal healing and internal listening to our staff and understanding how we get our culture pointed in the right direction. How do we think about our coverage in different ways? One of the big opportunities that I think you saw reflected in Wes's story is that we still have this opportunity to hear from our community and make concerted efforts to make sure that the community feels a part of our paper itself. So some of the things we've started building blocks around this, building up our new community advisory desk, bringing up teams inside of our marketing organization to start thinking differently about our touch and reach inside community. But we're still very much, if we're at the infancy of all of this work, the community stuff is sort of like pre-infancy around it, but we really need to spend the next segment of time thinking about that much more intensely to make sure that they're at the table as we talk about the future of our organization.
Yeah. 10 days in, what about you, Lisa? Where are you with this?
Well, we've been doing internal roundtables that Gabe and I have been hosting. So we've done about 5 or 6 of them so far. So it's really interesting hearing from employees. And what's landing for me is that this is a company-wide work, not just newsroom work. And while the work we produce is, of course, journalism that's done by 50% of the company, but also it's done by the folks in PD, product design and engineering as well, consumer marketing that's engaging with the community. So it really is all related. How do we engage with the community? How do we engage with each other? How do we become an anti-racist, organization? And I think that feels a little different than past efforts, where it may have just been concentrated in representation, say, in the newsroom. Now it's really work the whole company's doing.
Yeah. Gabe, what about you? Your thoughts?
I think it'd be completely different if that article had been published without the history of the last 2 years at the Inquirer, right? I think Wesley said, we, the Inquirer, have been working hard. I think the article frames it in a very public way. And if anything, it adds to the sense of urgency. I think we had a sense of urgency, but it seems now that the story is more broadly known and that the examination is so public, it seems ever more urgent.
Yeah. Yeah. And to your point, Gabe, that public kind of examination of the institution, but also, Lisa, you chose to write an op-ed, apologizing for the Inquirer's, 190 plus years of systemic racism and kind of outlining your commitment to wanting to get to that anti-racist reality that has been set down as a goal at the Inquirer. Can you talk about that? Where that came from for you, why you wanted to do that, and just really the importance of acknowledging the harm past and ongoing for some folks, frankly, in this process.
Yeah, I think when you boil it down, we're in the business of accountability. That's the business we're in, holding institutions and those in power to account. And so it only seemed obvious that we should hold ourselves to account. And we didn't know what the organizing principle was going to be. We read the piece, as you said, as it came out at 5 a.m. on the 15th, and then we had a lot of conversations. And of course, I'm not doing this by myself. I work closely with Gabe, with the head of our opinion desk, with the head of our community desk, Jameel, his deputy, Brittany May, to, really sort of put down on paper, what this means to us. The acknowledgement, that we believe this, that this is an impeccable group of journalists, you, Wes, 6,500 words. We have to own it. And we have to apologize to the Black journalists that have come before us and are still, working hard to represent, and the Black community that we haven't served particularly well. And that seemed important, to the whole institution to be able to move forward. And as we've all said, we're at the beginning of this.
Yeah. Well, I want to go back to 2020 because, obviously the racial reckoning was, that was the event that really was the catalyst for this entire project for me. And that is where we start with chapter 1. I am really wondering from each of you how the racial reckoning changed you as a journalist and how it changed your relationship to the Inquirer. So, Gabe, can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was not the editor at the beginning of the reckoning. I've been in this job for since November of last year. I think it sensitized me in a different way. We would all like to think, particularly journalists, that you have an ear and a sense of what a story is, that you have, after years in the trade, developed the skills to capture, the reality of the moment told through a story. I think it opened my view of how important that is, but also how limiting it is. Mm-hmm. How the instinctive, this is a story, I'm marching ahead, and I see it very clearly, and I know exactly what to do. It opens yourself up to a kind of professional liability in that you do not see your own blind spots. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that has been especially effective, I think, at the Inquirer is that we now have a structure, a kind of mechanism, so that we each learn from one another, and that collectively we address those blind spots. And just the fact that there's processes in place doesn't mean that you are now perfect, right? But it does mean that you have a greater likelihood of being far less imperfect, because collectively you're helping one another.
Yeah. How would you answer that question, Lisa?
Well, I had started in February of that year of 2020, and the lead of every article that I that talked about it was first female publisher. And so I was asked about that a lot. And I said at the time, I hope that I could use my power and influence to help underrepresented groups. And I started, and what I actually started to work on was our business that was, been so disrupted as newspapers have been for decades. And that our racist headline shifted my focus back to that original promise fast, because that was really a very obvious symptom of a much larger problem. And that became job one, like really figuring out, all right, how do we have a comprehensive DEI plan? What's the staffing we need to really start to institutionalize this and make the work we're doing not just, a few anti-bias trainings, but really start to put in place systemic change in terms of recruiting, representation, how we go about our work. Right at that same time, Gabe and others started the Inquirer for All, work streams in the newsroom to look at how we go about our work. So it really immediately moved all of that work to the front burner and said, we must do this before we do anything else.
Jameel, what about you? How did the reckoning change you as a journalist, and how did it change your relationship to the Inquirer? I know you're a native.
Yeah, And it's interesting because I wasn't working at the Inquirer during George Floyd's murder in the summer of 2020. I was working in diversity and inclusion at the time for another organization, and like most uh, people in general, certainly like most Black people, the murder and the resulting racial reckoning and the conversations about around race created a pull on me to make sure that the work I was doing helped to serve my community in a much more authentic and impactful fashion. So as I had conversations with Lisa and the Inquirer team about potentially joining, that's what actually drew me over to say, how do I come to an organization who what we do has a direct impact on my city, being born and raised in Philadelphia. The Inquirer, the Daily News are very much part of my story growing up. I went to the store to go get those papers for my parents. It has an impact on my culture, and it just has an impact on the community at large. So that was what was really critical for me to come over here. And honestly, that's what drives me in a lot of this work. Of if we can get this right, we start to create a framework for not just how we can do a better job of covering the Black community, but one where other local media outlets across the country can start to pick up our best practices and say, here's a way that we can better serve this community, and here's an organization where we can take their learnings in order to incorporate it into what we do. So that's my desired output from it. And that was all birthed out of the racial reckoning that came from 2020.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, if a 193-year-old paper can do this work and make the systemic change that is really going to make things different for this industry, for this community, for this city, then it is possible in other places across this country. And that's such a core tenet of why we wanted to do this project in the first place. So, I mean, look, I want to ask you then, what does anti-racism look like for each one of you at the Inquirer? What is the plan for getting there? And what will be different from the previous efforts at diversity and inclusion at the Inquirer? I think we've also just kind of talked about, I mean, how do you turn around 190 years? How do you do that? What does that look like in real concrete terms? So I'll stick with you, Jameel, on this question, and then I'll come back around.
Yeah, and I think to say anti-racism, it's been used a little bit as a cliche term these days, but understanding it's really critical that when you say you're going to be an anti-racist organization, your commitment is to more than just not being racist, right? So if we're going to be anti-racist, our commitment needs to be more than we're not going to treat Black journalists poorly at the Inquirer. That is not anti-racism, right? Like that is necessary. That's even beyond the floor, right? Like you shouldn't treat someone poorly because they color their skin. Those conversations were happening in 1960. So that means that we're going to take an active stance to combat racism where we see it bubble up, not just internally inside of our organization, but more broadly than that. So that shows up in the way that we think about our culture, that shows up in the way that we think about our coverage, that shows up in the way that we are transparent and accountable and around our work, that shows up in pieces, honestly, like this, Errin, that you're doing for a More Perfect Union, to start to look at these institutions and how systemic racism has and oppression has shown up inside of them, so that we can really make better decisions that impact Black people and BIPOC communities more broadly. So that's my stance around it, of how do we proactively combat racism and be an organization that not just holds ourselves accountable, but starts to create insight into systems of oppression that happen more broadly.
What about you, Gabe? What does anti-racism look like to you at the Inquirer?
Yeah, and actually, I do worry a little bit, about that term, because I think people will immediately think of something and then go in that direction. For us, I think it's in the journalism. It's in what we do as professional journalists. We have really, for the first time, processes in place to improve what we do. And ours is a trade, it's a craft, and it's actually an imperfect one. Deadlines make it imperfect for us. Anti-racism and the focus on that, the other way of saying that is providing consistently impactful coverage that is inclusive. where the story is as complete and as inclusive as possible. And we do, again, for the first time, have, and this is developing, and the road is long here. The kinds of conversations that are aimed at addressing systemic racism in coverage. We have to recognize that it is here, it is there, it is provable, and it is up to us collectively, to put in place practices, actual approaches that improved what is a trade with tools.
Yeah. Yeah. And Lisa, what does an anti-racist inquirer look like to you?
I think about it. I'm sorry?
How do you get there?
Well, I think of it as the publisher and CEO in terms of strategy and committing to a strategy and how we work. So that means writing a DEI business plan. That means, hiring, people who are really good. You can see Jameel's here, who heads the department. It means putting, a plan in place with measurable results.
Mm-hmm.
So, we have all sorts of different initiatives that are, from training to representation to how we recruit to pay equity to content and community engagement. And we do a quarterly report to the company where we lay out the plan for the year and say, these are the benchmarks we're measuring. Some are quantitative, some are others, standing certain things up. And then it's, being accountable to that every single quarter. And, we're never going to get 100%, but, I think we have to be transparent about how we're doing, what's working, because not everything's going to work. Mm-hmm. And we have to be honest about that too. Why didn't something work? Why was that an epic fail? And how do we use that as a data point versus just throwing up our hands and stopping? How do you move forward from that? So it's having a plan and executing the strategy and holding yourself accountable.
Okay, well, we've got some questions from the audience. Thank you for submitting these questions. I'm going to try to get to a few of them now. One question: what is the Inquirer doing to ensure that its journalists are culturally competent and able to manage their cultural biases? And whoever wants to jump in and start can take this one.
Yeah, I can start with it. Some of the things that we've looked at, I think training is important around awareness, but one of the things we know about training generally as a practice is it's not great at creating behavior change for it. The things that do actually create behavior change are updating your processes. So if you look at things like our style guide and making sure that we think about the verbiage that we use when we cover BIPOC communities, that's been really important for us. We recently rolled out what we call the Content Consult channel, which is a Slack channel inside our organization where people are able to post stories or thoughts, or articles that they're working on that might be covering marginalized groups if they want to get alternative perspectives. And there are people who are assigned to moderate and do research and come back to those individuals to help them better articulate their story and present it in a way that doesn't cause harm to those communities. We published an anti-racist workflow guide that helps all of our editors and journalists ask a series of questions as they're writing and editing an article to see whether or not our values of anti-racism are reflected there, and even give a license on when to use racism to call it out directly. So those things are processes that we start to put in place to say, okay, how do we make sure that no matter who's sitting in what seat, the way that we operate as an institution consistently addresses systemic bias that might show up.
Anything anybody wants to add to that before I?
Yeah, let me. Yes, and Jameel did a great job describing some of the processes in place in the newsroom. We have also gone through cultural bias, training, which is very helpful. But for us, the journalistic conversation has to be omnipresent, right? It has to be part of what we do, and the Content Consult channel that Jameel flagged is an ongoing conversation. And this is an opportunity for people to really expose their own sort of, cultural ignorance, which is not easy, right? So the people who participate in this very public conversation, because it's it's on a board where everybody could see. That has created, and it continues to build, a kind of shift in the newsroom where it is not only fine and permissible, it is encouraged and best practices for people to engage in those conversations, so that cultural biases, which we all have, do not make it into the stories and the journalism that we present to the communities in Philadelphia.
Okay, great. Next question. How does the Inquirer plan to expand on its apology to make amends and promote healing in the community? Lisa, do you want to take this one?
Well, I think it's doing great work and doing work that's has representation. And we've set up the community news desk, which Sabrina Vervulius is now the lead editor, and she is developing a content plan. And Gabe can speak more about the work that she is doing that will work across the newsroom as she begins to staff up. And I think that will have a really big impact on how we go about engaging the community. Gabe, do you want to say more about that?
Yeah, and actually, there was a phrase that Wesley said when Errin was talking to him, and he called it being in conversation, which really resonates with me, because one of the very valid criticisms of the Inquirer and other news organizations is that you are seldom present, and when you're present, you're not really capturing the community in its dimensions. And that is one of the aims of the community news desk that Lisa alluded to. It's essentially a journalistic approach that puts us in the community, and not as infrequent guests, but as journalists who are in conversation with people in the community, so that journalism reflects the full spectrum of people in Philadelphia and the region, and Black Philadelphia in particular. It should be noted, because that's where the grievance justified comes from.
Yeah,
because this is a majority Black city, and historically so, and the power of the story that Wes did is showing not only the impact from the community end, but also the impact within the newsroom because of the hiring practices and other failings.
right. So we have another comment and question here. Oh no, actually, this is kind of more of a comment, I guess, but I can speak to it. It's interesting that the Daily News was never mentioned in the reporting. The Daily News was the paper that the Black community felt was theirs. It did a much better job of covering the city in all communities than the Inquirer, which has always been focused on growing suburban readers, could never really mirror. So what I will say to that is that, again, the Philadelphia Inquirer is one of the oldest continuously publishing newspapers in America, which is why we focus on the Inquirer. The Daily News was founded in, I believe, 1925, so not even 100 years old yet. I do take the point, though, certainly, because I've heard from a lot of Black Philadelphians that the Daily News was the paper that they more closely identified with. Jameel, I'm sure you can co-sign that or correct me if I'm wrong here as the native, but I certainly take that point. So I think to close us out here, I want to just ask all of you. This project is, this chapter is out now. You all are continuing the work, but obviously that work does involve the community engagement that Wesley talked about, and this piece is certainly meant to be a tool for fostering that relationship a bit more. But I guess I'll just end by asking, why should Black Philadelphians believe the Inquirer? Why should Black Philadelphians support your efforts, especially given the history that we've laid out? And I guess what would all of you say to that in our closing thoughts? I will start with you, Gabe, and then I'll come back around.
Yeah, I don't think any of us are under the delusion that an apology is going to erase the past, right, and atone for the many failings. The story, captured many failings, but I think anything that would have been 600,000 words would have included many more failures. I think it's in the work that we do. We have to earn it. We really do have to earn it. If there's skepticism out there, again, it's justified. And the only way we can win the trust is in the hard work. I liked something else that Wesley said. He said, and it's going to make me think more deeply about this. He said, that the Inquirer is working and working hard. And then he said, but is it doing the right kind of work?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a question that we need to ask ourselves constantly. We can identify things that we have done that will help restore trust, confidence. Those are very high bars, right? Given what we know, the community sentiment is. We have things in place. It is not enough, and it isn't a fix that's addressed by one good act of inclusive journalism. It has to be consistent. We have to be dedicated, and we have to be vigilant.
Yeah, absolutely. Jameel, what about you? What would you say to Black Philadelphians about whether they should trust the Inquirer and whether they, how you earn their support from here?
Yeah, and I think for most of us, the answer will be it's not for us to tell you to trust us. It's for us to do the work and for you to see yourself reflected. So I think constantly looking to see whether or not we reflect the values through our coverage, through our operating, that truly reflect Black Philadelphia. The other thing that I'll add to it that sometimes get lost in this conversation is that there are Black Philadelphians in the Inquirer doing this work and who have strong reputations in the community. When I think about people like a Janice Armstrong and the work that she's done, people like Cassie Owens, who has been in Philadelphia and doing this work for a long time, Melanie Burney, like there's so many more, and I know I'm forgetting many in there, but know that there are Black Philadelphians in the trenches here with us to do this work. Even as I speak about things like those anti-racist guides and workflows and Black channels, those things weren't birthed through Gabe, Lisa, and I. They were birthed through our newsroom. People like Anna Orso and Elizabeth Wellington, who came up with these ways that we can do a better job of putting it. So there are people doing this work who reflect you and who are from the community and who are committed to seeing our community served better through our institution. So I think that's important to note as well.
Absolutely important to note. Lisa, I will give you the last word on this.
Oof, I don't know if I can add to both of those, but I think it's absolutely right. The proof has got to be in the work, and folks feeling like the journalism is helping them live a better life in Philadelphia, helping them thrive in the city that they love, is useful, is informative, is holding those in power to account, is representative in our point of view. That's how you build back trust. It has to be in the journalism, and it really helping you to live your best life in Philadelphia.
Yeah. Well, listen, I want to thank all of you for joining me. I want to thank all of you for frankly trusting Wesley to do this in the way that we did it. I think that it is something that was distinctive from what some other news outlets have done in terms of examining themselves. You all didn't do your own examination. You brought us in to do it, and that is not lost on me. I hope that we did a service not only to the Inquirer, but really to this community to show this paper to itself, but also again to really provide the platform and the forum for us to collectively have conversation, collaboration that leads to action, because that really is the point of this entire endeavor. So with that, thank you all so much for being here, and take care and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.